certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Crucial fibre evidence under scrutiny. Good to have you with us for day 70 of Claremont in Conversation. Natalie Bonjolo and Tim Clark with you. And also joining us, we welcome back Perth criminal defence lawyer Tom Percy QC. Tom, the last time we chatted to you on this podcast was during the civilian witness part of the trial. What's your opinion on how it's been tracking so far?
Seems to be tracking pretty slowly. I mean, I'd go down there if I had a chance, but it's been a bit of a merciful release for me that they don't let anyone in anymore. So I think the warning that was given to everyone at the very start by the prosecutor that after a while it would become incredibly boring, and it certainly lived up to its word.
Well, Tim has been sitting there in court every day during this trial, and during that time, you know, we've seen extraordinary measures, as you've said, put into place. And Justice Hall has said he is determined that this trial would continue. How crucial is it that they get the job done and that they get to see this through without interruption?
Well, there have been interruptions, and there may well be more interruptions, but I think the beauty of having a trial without a jury is that it just goes till it finishes, whereas jury trials can abort for all sorts of reasons. And I would have thought, had this been a jury trial, would not have got into this month. But look, I think it's important for the community that it concludes. I was speaking to a judge the other day who said he thought it probably had another 5 or 6 weeks to run. And if that's the case, then that will be a reasonably expeditious conclusion to it. But I think everyone in the legal profession is hoping that it ends sooner rather than later, because it's just become a bit like Blue Hills, hasn't it?
Well, it is very interesting, because despite the fact that the subject matter is very dry, there is still such intense public interest in the trial. Are you surprised by that?
Oh, no, look, anything like this was always going to have a lot of public interest. That never surprised me from day one, and I was never surprised when I went down there for the first month or so to see the lines of people waiting to get in, and the difficulty that you had getting a seat down there, even as a member of the profession, was quite remarkable. I've never seen the like of it. I mean, we all sat through Rainey. We sat through cases like when premiers of this state went on trial, Carmen Lawrence, Ray O'Connor, David Parker, people like that, enormously high-profile people, but it never drew the sort of crowds that this case has drawn.
Yeah, that's right. And Tim, you've seen that. It's been extraordinary, this duration. I mean, we're into our 4th month now, and you have seen extraordinary scenes at the court.
Yeah, we've mentioned it before. It started in a blaze of glory, and again today, I was the last man standing in court, apart from obviously the woman standing on her feet, Carmel Barbagallo, doing most of the questioning. The environment around the trial has changed, but the bubble inside the trial, it still grinds on. And as Tom mentioned there, the subject matter, particularly the last couple of weeks, has been pretty dry, pretty detailed. It can get quite wearing listening to fibre evidence and details of cloth and weave and colour and viscose and polyester, but I bumped into Carmel at lunchtime, and she said that she's admirable of anyone who's sticking with it because of the dry nature of it. But she did point out to me it is critical evidence as well, and that's why it's taking so long and going into so much detail.
That's right. And today, of course, you heard from people who were involved in the manufacture and the sales of the fabric.
Yeah, that's right. So we're digging into, really drilling down into the as you say, that who made the fabric, who it was sold to, and then what it was made into. And so a company called Bruck Textiles made the fabric that these Telstra pants were eventually made out of, and then that fabric then went on to Yaka, a very, very well-known Australian workwear manufacturer. And they were given the contract to make this Telstra workwear for many, many years, and we went back to the cross-examination of the witness that we had yesterday, and all of it surrounds exactly what type of shade, exactly what type of blend the material was, what colour it was, and whether there could be any other company, person, source of that fibre, or those fibres that were said to have been found on Jane, on Kira, on the Karrakatta victim, and in Mr. Edwards' car.
And did you get any information about, how much of this fabric was made and the companies that may have also been supplied it?
Yeah, that was the crux of the questioning from Michael Smith, who was the sales and marketing manager of Bruck Textiles. He described this Telecom Navy or Telecom Blue fibre. When it first came into circulation, he was asked who it was sold to and made for in particular, and his answers were really, there were a couple of small consignments sold to a couple of smaller companies, but the vast majority of it, more than 200,000 linear meters of this material, this 65-35 blend that had this very dark navy blue, this Telstra Blue, went to Yaka, and the combination of it all together, that fabric and the colour, was given the name or the nickname Llama. And then that was sold to Telstra for many, many years, and by the tens of thousands of meters, because you can imagine how many operatives in the field, both male and female, they had to dress in this fabric, which was specially made for them. And then, as we've seen in previous evidence with the order forms, every 2 or 3 years, every operative in the field was encouraged to order 2 or 3 more uniforms, so they would look their very best when they were mending phone lines up and down the coast of Western Australia. So that was how Mr. Smith was questioned, and as we've said previously, Justice Hall really nailed it when he got to his question right at the end, was how many meters went here and how many meters of it went to Telstra. And as I say, the vast majority of it went to Yaka and then went to Telstra.
I'll ask you a question, Tim, because you've been there and we haven't. So what line is the defence taking in cross-examination? Because that's usually how you tell where they're going with this. How are they seeking to impugn it? We saw it with the DNA. They took a line, as it seemed to me, that there was all sorts of potential contamination and that people had come up with different results in the lab. Things went missing and things along that nature. What sort of line is the defence taking in cross-examination of these witnesses?
They're really, Tom, they're really trying to get to a point where they can say, I think, Telstra was not the only company that used this colour, this fabric at this time. That's where they're trying to get. The questions, the cross-examination of Mr. Smith this morning by Mr. Edwards' co-counsel Genevieve Cleary, she pointed out that towards the end of the 90s, so after the murders, this fabric basically got into a lot wider circulation than it had in the mid-90s when the prosecution say these fibres were left behind. And so I took from that them to be trying to show, well, it wasn't just Telstra that these fibres were issued to around about the time, not specifically at the time of the murders, but around about the time. And that was the late 90s, which would then say to me that they're going to contamination again. I think they're going to try and show that, well, we don't think those fibres were left behind at the murder scenes or at the times of the murders. We think they were left behind in the intervening 20 years. And we saw that a little bit during the cross-examinations, during the post-mortem evidence, when everyone was asked, what were you wearing at the time? And what was the security like in terms of contamination around the scenes? And where had you been on those days prior to and during those post-mortem examinations? And I think that's where we're going to go to a lot to come as well, in terms of police have been asked that. Forensic scientists have been asked that when they've been examining the hair samples in 2004 and 2008 and 2012 and 2014. So that's my summation of where I think they're trying to go, is broaden out the scope of where this fabric could have been worn, and then try and find possible different sources of it other than the killer.
Do you think that there's any suggestion that they might be going down the line of, well, police wear uniforms of broadly this colour, and that some of those fibres may well belong to police officers from their uniforms?
Well, Miss Barbara Gallo tried to head that off right at the pass during her opening when she said, we say police uniforms could not have been the source of that. But I think next week when we get to the chem centre, so all the last couple of weeks have just been setting up for the real key chem centre witnesses when they come in, and they will actually put the fibres on the slides and show what they were made of and what they look like under a microscope. So I certainly the prosecution have thought of that possibility and are trying to head it off at the pass. And I've got to say, the last couple of weeks' evidence, there hasn't been any real evidence that that anything like this mixture of fibres could have come from a police officer, but that's not, or police uniform, but that's not to say that it won't be suggested certainly next week when we get to the chem centre analysts.
There's another suggestion that the dye that was used for the Telstra uniform was a specific type of dye, and it may possibly only have been used in Telstra uniforms. What can you tell us about the exclusivity aspect of the dye?
Yeah, well, that's really where they've spent the last 2 days drilling down into the exact number of the colour that was used, and then the number of the base material that was used, and the combination of those, the prosecution say, was for a large amount of time in the 90s absolutely exclusive to Telstra. So that colour might have been used somewhere else, but not with the right fibre, and that fibre might have been used somewhere else, but not with the right colour. So it's that combination of the two that the prosecution have really tried to close all the other windows and all the other possibilities, and today in cross-examination again, Liberty or Wagner Chavez is the witness's name that you heard about yesterday, and she was again asked about that and about the testing that was done on some fabric that was given to her to try and prove that, and the prosecution have spent a lot of their time over the last two days trying to show Justice Stephen Hall that combination of fabric and colour was exclusive to Telstra.
And Tim,
well, if they can make that point good, you'd think that would be a very strong plank in their case. But the question that arises to me, and perhaps you can answer this, is there any questioning on the lines of how likely it might be that materials would last in a car for over 20 years? I wouldn't like to think that if I sold my car now, that in 20 years' time the person who had it would still be able to find traces of me in it. So I don't know whether there's been any cross-examination down those lines.
Yeah, well, not yet, but because we haven't, so we haven't actually heard from the chem centre scientist that we've seen a picture of him, Peter Collins, actually doing that detailed analysis over the 11 days that we spoke of, and the pictures that the court released to us show the actual part of the car where they say that they found those fibres, and they are, if one can imagine in your driving seat in your car, the rails that the car sits on to enable you to move it forward and back. The prosecution say it's that right-hand rail underneath that, stuck in there somehow or somewhere among all the other debris, were these tiny microscopic fibres, and that's where they had been able to endure for all that time. Even though the car had been through several pairs of driving gloves over the journey, and it had been owned ultimately for 10 years by a gentleman up in the Perth Hills who was using it for his gardening business. So the prosecution say, well, they were there, they were found there, and that's how, because they were so ingrained, if I can put it that way, in the car's mechanics that's how they'd endured. But once again, we haven't really got to the witness that found those, and I'm sure that will be a strong tenet of the defence questioning. Is like, well, how likely is that these fibres can stick around for so many years?
Yeah, if I was a defence counsel, I can tell you it'd be the first port of call for me.
Mm. Well, you are a defence counsel, Tom, and that's why we're talking to you.
Tom, you mentioned a moment ago about the DNA. How strong do you think the defence argument was in relation to that cross-examination of the DNA?
Again, not being entirely privy to it, but I would have thought that there's always worries with contamination. They've exposed a lot of problems with the DNA evidence, but at the end of the day, if the Kira Glennon fingernail DNA holds up, then the defence have got some problems, I would have thought.
Mm. Tim, just coming back to the fabrics, you also heard today from this garment technician for workwear. Were they asked who they did supply the various uniforms to, and was the uniform only for these navy pants, or was this fabric used for other items of clothing?
Yeah, so this was a lady that has worked for Yaka or the various different iterations of Yaka over the years, and she was involved in designing and patterning workwear for many companies, and she was taken to those styles, the types of pants, the types of shorts, and she seemed to have an immaculate memory of what they were asked to produce for Telstra all those years ago, and there were two different styles of pants. There was some shorts which we see photographs of, and this fabric was specifically designed because it was very dark. It was a particularly dark shade, and she said that was used for the female half of the workforce for Telstra at that time as well. So, I mean, we've said it numerous times. The infinitesimal detail that we are delving into in this trial is extraordinary in itself. It can be quite taxing to listen to at times, but you only have to admire the amount of stones that have been upturned by both sides in trying to get to the very heart of the matter.
Tom, have you seen this much attention to detail when we're talking about things like a tiny fibre?
It's unusual. I've seen cases that have from time to time gone into this sort of detail because as a defence counsel you have to, but not to this length in relation to so many articles and in relation to so many issues, because I think what you've got to realise that this is really three trials going on at the one time. And usually, if you're doing a homicide case, you deal with one death at a time. multiple homicide cases are rare. So, especially when the bodies are discovered at different times, different locations, and one's not been discovered at all, you're really trying to run 3 trials at the same time. So the degree of difficulty in proving all of these things, in conjunction with what the prosecution say is a similar facts case or a propensity evidence case involving another case which has DNA issues as well. That's the Karrakatta offence. And then we've also got the Huntingdale offence as well. So effectively there's 5 trials going in, 5 sets of evidence cross-pollinating into one trial. So the short answer to your case is no, I've never seen it before, but then I've only been a lawyer for 45 years.
I mean, it's interesting you just mentioned one of the bodies, of course, hasn't been found, and we keep getting questions from listeners along the same lines, and that is, if Bradley Edwards were to be convicted and could offer the location of Sarah Spiers, is that something that would go to a lesser sentence?
Well, it would, but not. We're really only chipping around the edges because he's going to get, on any one of them, he'd get life with a really long non-parole period. He's going to get a very long cumulative sentence in relation to the Karrakatta rape and another one in relation to Huntingdale, to which he's pleaded guilty. So I would think there's certainly not much bargaining power in it for him. Mm-hmm. But who knows? I mean, it's possible that he'd get something off. But when we're talking about life with a 50-year minimum as distinct from a 49-year minimum,
yeah,
who knows?
Yeah. And we've seen in this that the prosecution and defence recently have had to make so many allowances because of the virus. Do you think there's any risk down the track that this could increase the chances of any kind of appeals?
Look, I think if the defence are happy to go on, given the situation, and the prosecution are happy to proceed, then that's something that's been reached by mutual agreement and wouldn't be the subject to any complaint in a court of appeal. It's really only where there's a problem which confronts an accused, it's not remediable, and he's forced in a position to have to go on, that you might have some complaint later on if you got convicted. But of course, he hasn't been convicted yet, so we'd have to wait and see if that arose. But from what I've seen, everyone's been happy with the progress of the matter, and there've been no procedural issues which could give rise to complaint, I would have thought.
Yeah. And you've written about this, and we've discussed it in this podcast, a catastrophe would be an outbreak in the prison, which wouldn't be just catastrophic for the prison system, but also for this trial.
Well, it's not quite as catastrophic for this trial as any other trial because you could adjourn this trial part heard. Mm. Yeah. So let's say it just became unworkable to go any further as of, say, next week, and some people came down with it, maybe the accused or whatever. You could adjourn it for 6 months and then start again, whereas with a jury trial, you have to abandon it and then get another jury in 6 months' time and start from scratch. So if we start this again, let's say a month down the track, if someone became infected, counsel or, goodness forbid, the judge or the accused or anything like that, when you're resurrected, it doesn't start from scratch. Everything just starts from where it was. So it's nowhere near the kind of catastrophe that it would be if it was a jury trial.
Yeah. And Tim, we have a question for you. There obviously has been talk that the trial could finish earlier than expected. And given this current situation, Megan wants to know if sentencing would be brought closer to in the next couple of weeks or in the next month or so. Would the court likely do the sentencing online?
3 really good questions in one there. The original estimate for the trial was 9 months. That was significantly pared back by those 2 guilty pleas that Tom's mentioned, and as he's also mentioned, that it's actually progressing pretty well given the circumstances, all the circumstances surrounding it. We heard today in the death throes of today's evidence that Miss Barbara Gallo has about another 3.5 weeks of evidence to go for the prosecution case. Most of that will be taken up with more fibre evidence, but we will also get to see Mr. Edwards' record of interview. Then there's going to be some legal argument surrounding the motive, the emotional upset that we talked about in the very early stages, and Justice Hall will have to rule on that and whether he's going to allow that evidence in to his ponderings before the defence case starts, because the defence need to know whether they need to address that or not in their case. So, look, weighing all that up, 3 weeks plus maybe another few days of legal argument, and then whatever the defence chooses to do, which is that's entirely their prerogative, and we know what the main question, or one of the main questions the judge is going to ask is Mr. Edwards likely to give evidence in person? If he is, that will extend the trial length quite significantly, I would have thought. So we're looking to finish earlier than was expected, but I think we've still got months rather than weeks to go. In terms of the sentencing, I'm absolutely certain that Justice Hall will consider doing some sort of streaming or live broadcast of his sentencing remarks when it comes to that. The verdict, I'm not sure, because that can bring its own issues. But if we are going to a sentencing, because as Tom says, the rape and Huntingdale will have to be sentenced. Obviously, there's verdicts to come first, but I'm pretty sure that Justice Hall will seriously consider that if we are still in the same environment that we are at the moment in terms of crowds and social distancing. And our state government here is warning us that we could have these restrictions on our liberties for 6 months. So, that takes us close to Christmas, and that's roundabout when you'd think we might get a verdict. So I would say there's a distinct possibility that the verdicts and certainly the sentencing in this case might be streamed to the world.
Yeah. Tom, if you were a gambling man, would you think the accused would take the stand?
I would think no. I would think you really can't add much to a case where you just deny anything or any knowledge of it. Sometimes an accused person has to give evidence. Let's say there's a consent sexual assault. You say it was consensual. They say it wasn't. You have to give evidence. Let's say there's a self-defence, grievous bodily harm or murder. You have to put that evidence there. But you know who done it. There's just really nothing that you can add. I mean, your best defence is attacking the Crown case. Now, obviously, Jovic knows this case back to front, and he knows what he's going to do. He keeps his cards pretty close to his chest. He doesn't talk to me about it. If I had to have a bet on it, I'd be betting that he wouldn't be taking the stand. In terms of how long the case is going to go, I agree with Tim. It's probably, we're looking at months rather than weeks. I did run into a judge the other day in the mall, and I said, "How do you think they're tracking with Edwards?" He says, "Probably only 5 or 6 weeks to go." And I thought, I wouldn't have thought so, because they've got to give final submissions, and they'd probably do that in writing. So it's not like standing up and make an oratorial address to the jury. It's the judge is there. You don't have to impress him with your oratory or your rhetoric. But you'd probably want some weeks to prepare written submissions, and then I think the judge will go away. He'll have to write a decision. You'd think that someone, and with great respect, I say this about him, he's a very organised judge. He would probably be writing the factual aspects of this as we go along to just relieve himself of the obligation to having to do it all at the end. And I would think he would probably reserve, it would be something like 2-3 months. So Tim's getting close to it, and it would be, I would think, getting on towards September, October, something like that, before we could expect a decision. Probably, depending what he's convicted of, if anything, other than the ones to which he's pleaded guilty, I would think, again, Tim is right, that there's such public interest in this and such difficulty getting all interested parties into the court at the time that, like the sentencing for George Pell, that was heard last May, I think it was, that Justice Hall would seriously consider representations from the media to broadcast the matter live.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing we've learned from this trial, and especially in the times in which we are now, and that is to expect the unexpected at times. Tim, do you know what we can expect from tomorrow?
Well, once again, I have to disappoint you and say nothing, because we finished our evidence for this week, and we finished all the evidence pre-Easter. So we won't be back in court now until next Tuesday, when, as I said, one of the main Chem Centre witnesses will will take the stand, and that will be his name is Rhys Powell, and he was one of the Chem Centre analysts that really hit the microscope hard and was comparing these fibres found on both Jane and Kira and various other sources to what the prosecution say were the actual sources, the car and the pants. And so we're going to hear, I've been reliably informed in intimate detail, fibre by fibre by fibre, where they were found, what happened to them after they were found, where they sat for all those years, and then eventually when the source was gleaned after Mr. Edwards' arrest, the analysis of that. So Mr. Powell is probably going to be the only witness for next week, so that will be 4 days of him, and there might be another Chem Centre witness after that. And then the prosecution's fibre expert, Dr. Ray Palmer, who is UK-based, will also be giving lengthy evidence, and that may well precipitate some late night sittings again because of the time difference to the UK, and obviously the fact that he can't travel here. So a fair bit to go yet, but we are now starting to get to the real heart of the fibre portion of the case.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for your time today, and thank you, Tim, and thanks for your company. If you'd like to get in touch, email us at claremontpodcast@wanews.com.au, and wherever you may be, have a safe Easter. Please stay at home. We'll be back with you Tuesday for week 18 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
For a fresh take on the news that matters, tune in to WA's newest morning show, The West Live, with Jenna Clark at thewest.com.au. The West Live not only delivers on what the day's big news stories mean for WA with hard-hitting interviews and analysis, but it will also make you smile with light-hearted chats and local gossip. The West Live, like talkback radio, but without the interruptions. Listen live weekdays from 8:45 a.m. on thewest.com.au or catch up with the podcast.